Our next speaker is Hayley Peter-Contesse from Oregon State University.
All right, thank you, Catherine, for that nice setup for my talk. I am a PhD candidate in soil science, and I study soil biogeochemistry in Kate Leuta's lab. So today I'm going to be talking about the post-fire effects of soil carbon persistence on and pyrogenic carbon in Oregon Western Cascades. And I first want to give a shout out to my co-authors on this work. It's truly been a team effort. So Catherine set this up nicely in terms of talking about some of the responses of soil carbon to fire. And I would say, given the changes that we're seeing in fire regimes as a function of climate change that we've been talking about throughout the symposium, we're particularly interested in the background or in the below ground effects of wildfire and implications for carbon cycling in west side forests, given that Pacific Northwest forests are an enormous store of soil carbon, and any losses of carbon, even small, could impact the global climate and climate feedbacks. So a long-standing paradigm in biogeochemistry is that frequent disturbance leads to loss of soil organic carbon, although some recent research has showed that this is not necessarily the case and that occasionally we can see increases in soil carbon post-fire. So we're really interested in looking at not only the physical and chemical implications for soil carbon, but also the disturbance effects and the environmental drivers of decomposition, how they're affected by fire, and especially differing severities in fire. So we know that plant roots and soil microbes play important and sometimes competing roles in helping to either stabilize or destabilize soil carbon. There are root exudates that roots provide to the microbial community, and by transforming those root exudates, the carbon can become either more stabilized and associated with minerals, or microbes can burn through it, and there can be losses of soil carbon. So there are a lot of competing processes going on that we're interested in kind of quantifying post-fire, both short-term and long-term. So I mentioned that mineral-associated pool, and there is a more stable mineral-associated carbon pool, as well as you can quantify a particulate organic matter pool of carbon. And the particulate matter pool tends to turn over more quickly, and it has a higher carbon content, but is more susceptible to decomposition than that mineral-associated pool. So really quantifying the ratio between those two can give us an idea of overall soil carbon stability. So wildfires that can vary in duration and intensity may impact those stabilization and destabilization processes differently, and those soil density fractions differently in the short and the long term. So another form of stable carbon is pyrogenic carbon, and that is a type of carbon that can be, it's a spectrum of burned biomass, anywhere from some lightly charred organic matter to all the way to soot. And you can see that the combustion temperature can make a difference in terms of the degree of aromatic condensation. So we see on the low end of temperature, it's less aromatically condensed, and on the high end, more. And that will have implications for its resistance to degradation. So quantifying that pyrogenic carbon is another way we can look at soil stability post-fire. So terrestrial soils can contain anywhere from 0 to 60% pyrogenic carbon, and they average around 14%. And that pyrogenic carbon cycles on the order of millennia rather than decades or centuries. So we know microbes and fungi can find a way to break down those carbon compounds given the right conditions, but that overall this is a much more stable carbon source. So this brings us to some of our questions about how burn severity impacts soil carbon stabilization and destabilization. So we are doing a bit of a follow-up study on some work done previously by my colleague Derek Pearson, and he found in the nearby H.J. Andrews that by removing roots, there was a very interesting and unexpected increase in mineral-associated organic matter, that carbon pool that tends to be more stable over time. And we were interested in following that up because a high-severity fire might provide some similar, a corollary to that work, basically. And we might be able to see this influx of dead roots that could provide some stabilization mechanism that was similar to what he had seen in the artificial plots that he had been studying in. So some of our specific questions about soil carbon stabilization were how does fire severity impact stable soil carbon? We know that the tree roots often persist after fire, but that the sugars that come from the roots may stop or slow. So the question is, what stabilizing and destabilizing mechanisms are in place immediately after the fire? And another question is related to the more stable, more aromatically condensed pyrogenic carbon. We wonder, as it's moving through the system, where is it going to, where is it coming from, and how are those changing long term? And so finally, how is that system evolving over time? And something we should acknowledge is that the short and the long-term behaviors of pyrogenic carbon might differ, and they may influence which stable or more ephemeral carbon pools it ends up in. So for our study, we were interested in looking at effects from the Holiday Farm fire, and so we sampled in 30 sites across the footprint of the fire, but mainly focused around the Andrews, and they were in low, moderate, and high severity burn sites, as well as control plots that were unburned in the Holiday Farm fire. So we classified the areas by burn severity, and then when we got out into the field, we verified that the burn severity was as it had been mapped, and if it wasn't, we moved the plot. And so when we sampled the soil carbon, or the soils at different depths, we measured the organic horizon and removed it to expose the mineral soil below, and sampled those 4 depths down to 30 centimeters. And at that point, we density fractionated the soil, again, to split it into that mineral-associated and particulate pool, so that light and that heavier fraction of carbon, and look at how the properties may be affected by fire. So here we have some preliminary results, and they're split out by density fraction, and then colored by soil burn severity class with depth on the x-axis, and then mean carbon content of just the fraction on the y-axis. And so we can see that there are some evidence that intense burns produce potentially more stable soil carbon, and I should note that the charcoal typically comes out in the light fraction, so that's some of the reasons for seeing that high severity, higher carbon content in that light fraction. And also note the difference in magnitude between the particulate soil and the mineral-associated soil fraction. That is commonly the case. So From this, we do have some evidence that intense burns produce a stable form of soil carbon, and it's not shown here, but when we break out the carbon content by mass recovered in fractionation, we do see a nice trend of decreasing carbon by depth in both fractions. But what does all this tell us about post-fire soil carbon dynamics? So to answer that, I first need to briefly explain this method, benzene polycarboxylic acid, which we use to get at the pyrogenic carbon fraction. So briefly, we digested the soil in concentrated acid at high temperature to cleave these benzene rings off of the bigger aromatic sheets. And so that number there will indicate the degree of aromatic condensation of the original BPCA. So by quantifying those, we can really tell how big the original structure was. So for example, that B6Ca is more aromatically condensed and represents a more stable, persistent form of soil carbon. So here are some of our preliminary results on BPCA, and this is just in the light fraction. So we have soil burn severity class and pyrogenic carbon concentration. And then we have it broken out by depth in centimeters on the top. And we can see that generally the patterns are expected, where we have the lower pyrogenic carbon in the lower burn severities and higher in the high. But we were really surprised to see that in the control plots, that basically covered the range of variation in all the rest of the burns. So we wondered why that may be the case. And so then we looked into the burn history. And basically, this is zoomed into a corner of H.J. Andrews Forest. And they have excellent data over H.J. Andrews. I do not have burn history over the entire sampling area, but basically I put my plots on the map in terms of where the site locations were, and then the Holiday Farm fire burned, and the Andrews map is classified by fire history. So you can see that a lot of those control plots and some of the other plots had burned many places previously. So that can provide some evidence that we're really picking up a lot of that legacy of fire effects, not just the Holiday Farm fire. And digging into that a bit further, we plotted that count of the fires since 1800 by the pyrogenic carbon concentration with the sites that we had coverage for. And so we can see a nice trend in increasing pyrogenic carbon in the count of, well, correlating with the number of fires that had burned there. So this study was really a baseline assessment of soil carbon density fractions and pyrogenic carbon pools soon after the fire, but we're interested in long-term changes in the processes that affect soil carbon. So we intend to resample sites 5 and 10 years post-fire and assess whether proportions of light and heavy fractions have changed during that time, and proportions of BPCAs have changed with that time, as well as kind of studying, instead of studying these things in isolation, we need to take more of a process-based approach to analyzing the way that soil carbon enters and leaves the system after a fire, especially in the long term. So in particular, we want to know if some proportion of those BPCAs have migrated from the light to the heavy fraction. And with that, I would like to acknowledge and thank everybody who's been a part of this work and invite any questions.
Hey, that was really interesting to see the fire history and putting your sites on top of that. And I was wondering if we might be able to tell the legacy of fire or the age of fire based on the depth of the Pisces incorporation, or if you looked at that at all.
Right, so the question was about looking at depth of soil and correlating that with the legacy of fire effects. We definitely expect that the deeper soil horizons will have captured some of those older fires, but with bioturbation, it's difficult to be able to correlate to a very specific fire event. When you're sampling out there, you can see actual bits of charcoal in the soil, and as deep as you go, you can find them throughout. So you definitely see those legacy fire effects. I do not have the methods to do that. I think they are available, but it would be really interesting, especially in the Andrews, where we have really good data on those legacy fires to correlate that. So that's data that I'm looking into. Yeah. In the back?
Question for you about soil textures. Did soil textures vary much with your sampling sites? And in particular, what might the role of clay content be in your results?
Okay, so the question was about soil texture and how that varied, and as well as how clay content may influence my results. Soil texture did not vary a ton. We were trying to concentrate our sampling in a pretty small area. I think I can go back to that. Yeah. So you can see those samples aren't spread out a ton throughout the Andrews and surrounding sites. Our original intention was to kind of stratify by a bunch of different parameters that we had, and that didn't end up working out great, but so we had similar soils across the sites that, because of the number of samples we had and just sampling constraints, I would say we didn't have a great way to make sure that we were covering all different texture classes and whatnot, but the density fractionation method is really good for picking up for looking at different soils at the same time. And as far as clay content, yes, there was some variation in that, and these are all very high clay soils. And that means that there is already a high degree of kind of mineral association possible with these soils, high cation exchange capacity, high water holding capacity. I don't know how that might influence the pyrogenic carbon at this point, but in the future, it's possible that the pyrogenic carbon fraction, it's been shown in other papers, can actually take the place of some of those clays on the or associate with the minerals and absorb to those minerals and take the place of other ions. So to be seen in future. Okay, just one more. Right. So I remember that from the first day of these talks. The question is about the soil drop that happens after a fire and how to kind of make comparisons between those control sites and the sites that had burned. I will say that we have data on bulk density and that we can make comparisons, and that by removing the organic horizon when it was present, even in those control plots, and getting to the mineral soil, we are effectively measuring the same depths from 0 to 30 centimeters. There's actually a lot of churning that looked like it happened post-fire in some of those high severity soils. So I think that might, and some of that mixing might be more of a concern.